welcome back to 10% True. Thanks for joining us for this, your third excursion on the channel.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
So for anybody listening, as we've just said, third excursion means there's 2 prior episodes. So go back and watch those if you haven't already. In the first episode, Nick, you talked to us about the fast jet training pipeline that the RAF had in place when you went through flying training. And you talked about the tactical weapons unit and the tactical weapons conversion unit and the triple TE. And then in the second episode, you talked to us a bit about life on an operational Tornado squadron, and that included a really great description of low-level flying and how the TF system and the Tornado works, as well as some of your operations over Iraq and various other things. So I think this is turning into a tour de force of Tornado discussion. I'm really enjoying it, so thank you very much.
Me too. It's a pleasure.
So today then we'll in episode 1 and maybe a little bit in episode 2, you talked a bit about going back to the tactical weapons training unit. Was it what's the name of it at Valley?
Well, so at the time it was called Fast Jet Tac Weapons. There were 2 training squadrons on Anglesey at 4 FTS. That's 4 Flying Training Squadron. Sorry, 4 Flying Training School. One dealt with pure flying aspects of the Hawk, so the students came in having flown the Tucano, a bit like the T6 Texan, and done all the basic flying type stuff, and then they had to learn to do that in a faster jet in a similar way that the American students may have gone from the USAF from the T-37 to the T-38. And so the courses, broadly speaking, are now just to fighter lead-in, something like that. So they're starting to use the aircraft, learn to use the aircraft as a weapon system. They get exposed to a variety of different skill sets. It is really a whistle-stop tour through the different roles, and they get a feel for what they're good at, what they enjoy, and then from that they get a posting to a frontline aircraft type. So yes, that was the way it went.
So you returned there as an instructor, and you shared some of your observations about what that was like.
Yeah.
And then you returned in, was it 2003? No, 2004. You went back to 9 Squadron at RAF Marham, which is in Norfolk, to fly the Tornado again.
Yeah.
Pick up the story then. What did you bring to the guys at Marham based on that experience then?
So I think the career structure changed slightly. To be a squadron instructor pilot, or squadron QFI as we called it, generally guys had done a tour as a pure flying instructor. I just think the fighter lead-in role and the more applied flying that we did there was much more relevant to being a frontline squadron QFI. In particular, the how-tos, how to get the best out of the airplane. Obviously, the weapons instructors, the patch wearers, had a significant impact on the tactical stuff, but trying to help people get the best out of the airplane, because it really didn't help you that much. That was the thing I felt that I could really bring to the role. I think one of the great things about being an instructor at Tac Weapons was flying with people from different backgrounds. So I had to teach BFM, 1v1 visual combat, and that was a core skill that everyone had to do. So as a Tornado GR pilot, it wasn't something we'd done a lot of, potentially a bit of a black art. So I was pestering all the guys with either a fighter background in terms of like air defense, the Tornado F3, or we had Mirage 2000 French exchange pilot there. We had an Aussie F-18 pilot. I was pestering those guys like, can you explain exactly what I am looking for? And sometimes people kind of struggle. They've been doing it long enough that they recognize pictures subconsciously, and they just knew what to do with those situations. And there was nothing better than going flying with those guys to see what they did with the airplane, where they placed the lift vector in combat, and how they flew the airplane. Because you can learn, having seen those pictures, you can learn by imitation. So coming back to the front line in the 2-seat environment, I think that's one of the challenges with the whole setup is, how do you teach someone when they can't jump in the back with you? It was unheard of, really, for, let's say, the junior pilot to jump in the back with the squadron weapons instructor to see how he did it. But if you were to draw the parallel with either a Harrier squadron or a Jaguar squadron in the RAF, or potentially, I imagine, with your C model Eagle or even F-16 guys, they could go in the tub with the patch wearer and watch how he runs his radar. When does he take a particular mode? How does he organize his cockpit? So that learning by imitation is so much harder in a 2-seat squadron. I mean, the way I got around that when I was organizing the training as like a deputy training officer was I tried to put a weapons instructor on the console of the sim when, for example, a new guy was learning the targeting pod, to give them the best possible instruction from the best targeting pod operator on the squadron, when he's doing his first few goes at it in the simulator. But after that, it just has to be via tape review and debrief and things like that. And obviously you do the best you can, but I'd like to emphasize what I think is so important is the power of learning by imitation and watching someone. So, I'd seen that work for me at Tac Weapons, and then it was a case of, right, how do I bring that to a two-seat squadron with the limitations that I've just highlighted?
We didn't really ever explore, mostly because we were just having a tremendous time going through the different stories and talking about sort of weaponeering and using and employing the aeroplane as a weapon system. But we never really talked about then the handling qualities of the aeroplane, the handling characteristics of it. It's a fly-by-wire aeroplane. We talked a little bit about, sort of some of the defensive techniques that you might use to get away from an attacking fighter or whatever. But did you then get back to when did you get? Well, you didn't get back to it. Did you go to 9 Squadron then with a set of instructional techniques in your pocket that were new or different?
I don't think so. It's really a case of what I felt passionate about and going, right, okay, what have I seen work? I would characterize myself as just an average guy. I've seen some of the other people that you have interviewed, and I've been massively impressed with their career profile and what they're, patch wearers. They've done trials. They've done all sorts of stuff. And I don't really count myself in the same league as those guys. So I think, well, what worked for me? How did I get better as an instructor at Tac Weapons, and now how do I, given the limitations, translate that to being in the front line? So when I came back, I did a short refresher course on the Tornado conversion unit up at Lossiemouth before then coming back to the front line. And of course, in the time that I've been away, the squadrons had transitioned from the Tornado GR1 to the GR4. So I'd gone from a legacy instrument set. The classic Hawk that I flew and instructed on was no head-up display. It was just legacy dials, 1970 stuff. But we tried to up the workload for the students by giving them sets of checks or SOPs to follow. But what it could never replicate was just the complexity of modern frontline aircraft types. The Typhoon wasn't in service with frontline squadrons at that point, but the classic Hawk was always going to struggle in terms of the limitations to the hardware fit as to how it can prepare students for flying the Typhoon. It's just like 2 generations past, to go to that. And I even noticed coming back to the GR4 that with the new wide angle head-up display, there was a lot more information there. I felt saturated. I came back from the Hawk, and I got loads of essay from just the TACAN and legacy instruments on and head-down display. And I found all of a sudden this wide-angle HUD just had too much. And I was going, oh man, I almost had to go head-down to cherry-pick the information I needed. But of course, like anything, you get better at dragging out the most relevant parameter at the time and being able to look in the right place to grab that piece of information at the right time under high workload. So that was the big thing, was really kind of coming back to a jet that had matured. It had smart weapons, 1553 data bus, so that the smart weapons it could carry included what we call the E-Paveway 2, which is effectively a 1,000-pound class weapon with a GPS guidance kit that also could take laser designation. So that was a kind of primary weapon. And of course, Alarm 2 was in service. Brimstone came into service, and later dual mode seeker Brimstone. And just a lot more sort of smart weaponry had come into service, in the time that I'd been away. So
we'll delve into the Alarm piece and the Brimstone piece and the EGBU in a minute. But can we stick with just the flying bit for the moment then? And just,
of course, yeah.
Before we hit record, you were talking about coming back to the Tornado, going to 9 Squadron, coming back to the Tornado. Having handrails and putting in place sort of methods or rules of thumbs that you could teach other guys in the squadron as a QFI. Can you just summarize what the aeroplane is like to fly then before talking a bit about some of those
of course.
Handrails?
So basically the aeroplane is pretty straightforward to fly in basic terms. The the novel parts of it are having variable geometry wings, so you have to sweep them. Unlike the F-14, you have to put the wings in the right position at the right speed. It doesn't tell you by burble or buffet or anything like that. I mean, the alpha will just go up and up and up if you haven't moved the wings forward. Modern 4th gen fighters will have the camber of the wing change automatically when you pull G to get the best lift out of the wing. We had to select through a switch on the throttles maneuver slat that came out in 45 wing, and then flaps came out automatically to match that when the wings came forward to 25. And if you swept wings back to 45, the flaps would retract as the wings swept back. So it was just very mandrolic. So it didn't save you from overstressing either. There was no limitation on that. As the Alpha built, the aircraft became progressively heavier to fly, to the extent that if you were in flat scissors or something like that, so low speed, high alpha reversals, it was a two-handed operation to fly the aircraft. I understand, although I didn't fly the F3, that the stick loads in the air defense variant were much lighter. And I, as a personal opinion, I would like to have seen the stick loads lighter. I think you can fly with more precision if you're not having to kind of muscle the stick around. The reason for this was the spin prevention and incidence limitation system, and it's basically trying to discourage you from being aggressive with the reversals at high alpha in case the aircraft departed. So part of the handling check that we would do annually was that you would get the candidate to take the aircraft into this high alpha regime, do some reversals, and work out how to get the best out of the aircraft. And typically that would mean a slight unload, a dab of rudder, as you apply a lateral stick input to get the reversal on, before then loading back up to the alpha limit. The problem is that if you got the nose low, we had very little nose authority to bring the nose back up. If you can compare and contrast that with when the spills, this incident limitation system, was switched off, the stick was further forward, the loads were much lighter, the aircraft was more sprightly. So I've heard people talk about, flying the F-14, for example, and these real names within the F-14 fleet, you knew how to cheat. They would pull circuit breakers, they would do anything that would give them an edge. I think, if I was going to be taking the aircraft into combat, then this is the sort of thing you would need to do. But then you're actually breaking a rule to do that. And I don't know anybody that did any sort of practice with this, the spills switched off, and you can't really go into war doing something new for the first time that you haven't trained to. But yeah, as has been alluded to, we're in a bad place if we find ourselves in a flat scissors with anyone, because they'll out alpha us and get above us and get behind us in no time. So it's not a place that we'd really want to be. But yeah, summarize: flying the aircraft didn't help you, easy to overstress, difficult to fly well, and difficult to get the best out of it. But it didn't turn that well, so you have to be aggressive with it to get the best out of the truck. It turns like a truck. Well, you just got to be aggressive with the truck, but right to the limit.
Were there any particular sort of foibles that the aeroplane had? And I think a couple of things I think about the F-111. There was a part of the F-111 flight envelope, I think, where if you were low with the wing swept back and inverted, there was a rule about recovery where so when they would crest a ridgeline, if they had the wings all the way back, they would never go to the inverted point and pull down because they wouldn't be able to recover. And I can't remember the aerodynamic phenomenon. I've had, I've forgotten his name. I'll have to trim this out because that's embarrassing. Who did I have? What's his name?
Was he Aussie or American?
Brad Inslee. Yeah,
Right.
so I had Brad Inslee on the program, and a couple of years ago he talked about that. I'll put a link to his interviews in the description somewhere. But he talked about the dangers of those sorts of things. So were there any little idiosyncrasies around the Tornado that were like that? And as a secondary question, if the answer is no, you can go straight into the secondary question, which is, what was the acceleration like? People talk a lot about the F-111 being able to accelerate. So the stories you hear about things like Red Flag are, these F-111s out accelerate everybody, but the RAF fly underneath you. So that seemed to be our thing rather than going fast. But what was
there were no idiosyncrasies really. I mean, 67 wing, I don't know many people that would overbank kind of ridge rolling in 67, mainly because the pitch response wasn't so great. So if you were doing aggressive maneuvering like that, we had a training limit of 150 degrees of bank, so you'd never go fully inverted. And one of the tactical limitations of doing that is called a wing flash. It's just changing the platform profile of the aircraft. So actually you can make yourself more obvious by doing this over bank, to 150 degrees of bank and then pulling down to contour into the valley. You might be better just to accept a slightly higher height above the ground as you bunt, but the kind of the area presented to somebody looking down at the aircraft doesn't change so much, and it's that kind of change in profile that generates conspicuity. It means that people will spot that. So yeah, 67 wing, really straight line running, high speed, not really doing anything more than like a couple of check turns to see if somebody was still following you. In terms of acceleration, yeah, it was really good. I was qualified as a passenger pilot, so I would take people, sometimes the maintainers, sometimes VIPs. But one of the things that I'd do with them was out over the sea where you didn't have to worry about noise, slowed to 250 knots, the wings at 25 with the maneuver flap and slat down, and then just slam it to max reheat, and then just clean the wing up. 350 knots, swept the wings to 45, and then as you go through probably about 450, go to 67, and then we go to 550 knots, and then stick the airplane on its arse. And it was lovely because you get to see your world through their eyes. You say, right, look back over your shoulder, and you can see the world just dropping away. And then you put a roll in, and it's going, this is just the best job in the world. I love my job. And it's serious most of the time, but there's a time and a place for exuberance, and to kind of controlled exuberance, but to show people this is what we can do. And you can see I've got a smile on my face now. It's such a happy memory to see it through their eyes, and just to sometimes fly for the joy of it. So our fit limit speed wise, I mean, we could do supersonic, but you'd have to have cleared all the stores off, and for the most part the training limits were subsonic. The early GR1s had the supersonic ramps still fitted, and the F3 had them, of course. And I understand that it made a big difference around 1.3 Mach, that you would suddenly get another surge of power. But they were disabled for most of the GR1s, and certainly by the time I got to it, and in the GR4. So yeah, we wouldn't be able to outrun an F111, because I did a flag with those guys there. And they were the Australian ones, and they're very laconic about the size of a WES, the stern WES. When you're doing 1.2, it's pretty small. So they're going to have to be right in your shorts before they're going to have a weapon solution for a stern shot. They're granted. So yeah, the F111 was quite a machine, and with loads of gas as well. That's the other great thing about the machine. So.
Can you tell us then a little bit about some of these handrails, or give us an example of what a handrail is then? Yeah,
sure. So I, as an instructor at TAC Weapons, they would give the students, right, for example, in a BFM scenario, slightly artificial, but if you decided to pitch back into the fight, they would say, right, well, you can run to base height, and if you're at 10,000 feet and 390 knots, you can pitch back to the light buffet, looking back over your shoulder, and you won't overstress the jet. And the training limit for the Hawk at that stage was 6.9 G. But they say, well, if you're going faster than that, then you're going to need to pull to the G limit and wait for the speed to bleed, and then transition to the light buffet. So the Tornado didn't really talk to you like that. And as I said, it was easy to overstress it. And then, you'd have to come back and report it to the engineers, and the aircraft is lost to the squadron for the rest of the flying day whilst they do the checks. But one handrail I do remember, I just went out and did some test flying, to be honest. I was thinking, okay, I want to teach the guys how to be aggressive with the airplane so that they can get the best out of it. So I thought, okay, in a training fit, let's do, I'll do an imaginary lead turn, a break into someone to get to the max G, and then transition, getting the wings forward between the various G and alpha limits. And they did change as the aircraft slowed down. But yeah, typically you would end up like 25 degrees nose down with max reheat, and you could hold the alpha limit 21 units and 4G. So for the guys who are used to flying F-16, F-15, it's lame, isn't it? 4G is nothing. We could pull 5 with wings at 45. So that initial brake turn, if we had less than 4 tons of gas, we could pull more. But it just really illustrates that we were not somebody that is going to really sort of aim to turn and burn for any significant amount of time. We try and use numerical advantage if we had to stay and fight, but generally speaking, try to deny the first shot and then try to separate and run whilst calling for delouse from your fighter protection.
So what we can see behind you is an interesting fit on that jet, and one of the things that I'm sure will pique a lot of interest and get some ears pricked up is that one of the things that you did on 9 Squadron was seed.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that then, and what it meant to you, and the fit on the jet behind you, and what we know that alarm was the weapon, and it's interesting you've referenced Star Baby before in terms of his descriptions of going out and shooting harms and that kind of stuff. And one of the things that he said which was really interesting, was that the Brits would never say anything about alarm, wouldn't tell anybody anything about it. So he had I said to him, how did it work? I have no idea how it works. They never told us anything. So the system's out of use, but obviously there are some things you're not going to talk about. But what can you tell us about it? What can you tell us about the mission? What can you tell us about what SEAD meant, or SEAD meant to you as a Royal Air Force Tornado pilot?
Yeah, so when I came back to 9 Squadron, it was really 9 and 31 that were the SEAD role specialists. When I say role specialists, it didn't take up a massive amount of the flying. I would say maybe 25%. That's a rough percentage. So if you were to compare us to, a Block 50 CJ Squadron doing, the force protection mission that they've got, I think they spend a lot more time training to it than we did with the alarm. I guess, to kind of reference a little bit of history, the requirement for alarm came out really during the Cold War, and it took some time for the missile to be developed. From what I understand in open source materials, it was to do with the rocket motor. They had trouble with getting it to work within the way that they wanted it to. In essence, what you see here is a couple of GR1s from 31 Squadron. They were based at Bruggen, and the fit that you've got there is one that really would limit the range of the aircraft. But the missile was really designed to punch a hole in the flot where all the mobile SAMs would have been, to allow follow-on strikers to go through that hole and then prosecute their mission. So obviously there's the debate about suppression versus destruction of enemy air defenses, but one of the capabilities of the missile was called corridor suppression. So you could fire off a salvo of the missiles, and they would seek out targets in priority order and start to engage those, and that would work really well for a low-level ingress for a strike package. I think the thing to highlight is that the GR1 was not really capable of smart weapons handling. It didn't have any interface between the aircraft and the missile. So the crews would have done their mission planning and then put the mission data onto a media that was then transferred to a piece of equipment that run by the engineers called PUGs, which I think stood for Programmable Upload Ground Station or something like that. But think of a box that they would plug into each mission and upload the mission files detailing the target's location and the priorities, which system they're looking at, all the electronic warfare library stuff that you've heard generically talked about by Star Baby. But once it was uploaded to the aircraft, then there was no interface capable with the missile on the GR1 because it had no data bus. So, the sort of endurance the aircraft would have on a low-level mission would be probably 40 minutes, 45 minutes. The fit would have around 5 tons worth of fuel. So this kind of mission would be get airborne out of Bruggen, volley off the missiles for the first push through the flot, and then return. The corridor suppression mode that was talked about never really was used or even talked about or trained to after the Cold War finished, and we transitioned to the GR4, which is where I joined the role. So when I arrived on 9 Squadron, then it was a role generally that took part in exercises. We do a workup for people. It was a role specialization along with some of the other smarter weapons like Brimstone, as we'll come on to. But in essence, I would summarize by saying it was not that easy to plan and not that easy to operate. Very mandrolic overall, best suited to targets of known location, and the aircraft has no emitter location system. So all the great stuff that Star Baby was talking about in terms of range quality and stuff like that, we would have relied on a good in picture beforehand to make the best plan we could, and then an airborne update from an EW asset like the Nimrod R1 or the rivet joint. So that would have been passed over the radio, and of course, there are limitations to how you can do that. You might talk about a certain system as fragged, so that its location was unchanged, or it might be placed or described reference bullseye. But you can appreciate that any changes would be potentially quite tricky to react to effectively. I think probably the best thing to do is to explain generically how we might plan a mission, and then explain why it was difficult to adjust to the changes. We talked about the pugs. Now, when I came to the GR4, that had been superseded by PC pugs. So effectively, the modeling of the missile, the seeker, all that stuff was on a laptop, a secret laptop. So in terms of prosecuting attack, we decide, okay, what is the threat system? And without going into too much detail, the PC pugs allow us to choose ranges that achieve the probability of kill that we were looking for. There was some planning in parallel with the regular Tamper, which is a bit like Falcon View, the mission planning aid that you would plan the rest of your mission with, and you would eventually incorporate or export the mission from PC pugs to the Tamper. But at the initial stage, you would be coming up with a plan that, we need to come in from that direction because it gives us some terrain screening. And then you'd try to work out the range you wanted to fire from, given the effect you were looking to achieve. And that would effectively come up with an iron bomb fire point. So think of it as a place from which the missile, if it lost any connection with the main computer in the aircraft through the data bus, it would go, okay, well, you've got me to this place and I know where the target is from here. If you have the data bus link working, then potentially you could manipulate it and take the aircraft and the missile somewhere else. But this iron bomb fire point was like a reversionary means of delivering the weapon if the ROE allowed it. So, in terms of planning the launch point, there were different modes we could use. Now, we've talked about corridor suppression. That had become a moot point by that stage. The main modes that we could use were direct, which is effectively like the harm, where it would trajectory shape based on the range of the firing. And as Star Baby said in the past, that these shots are going to be slower than a SAM. So any shots you take are shots of retribution if you're being shot at yourself. So that direct is the first one. Loiter is the unusual capability that the alarm had. And dual is a compromise between the both, neither the best bits of either. But loiter is an interesting one because effectively the aircraft, having delivered the missile would climb to height and then deploy a parachute. And then the missile would be over the top of the target set, waiting for the threat system to be detected. And at some stage it could, if it got the criteria, then detach the parachute and then the weapon would free fall. So that's quite unusual. So I think honestly the main strength of alarm is that the enemy is at the time, the threat nations were likely to be familiar with harm, but the unusual thing about alarm is this loiter capability. So they think, okay, well, I did my procedural switch off of the radar transmitter and the launch aircraft's gone away. I'm good. But you're not, potentially, because this missile's in the parachute, then drops the parachute and then free falls to detonate around the threat radar and may achieve some damage or a kill. The challenge, if you can imagine, loiter is the wind effect. And And of course, as has been alluded to by Baby and others, that your threat system, if you are engaging a battery, is not just a single launcher, or a single radar. It might be one radar, or it might be like a battery of SA. It might have multiple telars there. So how do you position this missile in its parachute so that the seeker's going to see what it needs to see? So think of a torch dangling under a parachute that's descending. A torch beam that's diverging slightly, and the footprint it has on the ground is kind of analogous to what the seeker can see and what the missile could reach kinematically. So the lower, you can imagine, if it's in its parachute, the higher it drops the parachute, the greater capability it's got to maneuver whilst free falling and gliding to engage the target. The wind could be a major limiting factor. So yeah, we could adjust a bit for that. But as the weapon drops, the footprint of the torch beam on the ground gets smaller. The basket that it can engage gets smaller. It's massively, massively complex. So the people who were most knowledgeable about the system generally had done a lot of work talking to industry. And, say MBDA, who are the manufacturers, were excellent. Always on hand to answer questions. And I think we really did need them. I wouldn't account myself as an expert in alarm. I know a couple of characters who were really good and who were involved in the Second Gulf War. But I think, honestly, I would be minded, if it was my plan, I would be saying, right, to my contact at MBDA, this is the effect I'm looking to have. This is the disposition we've got. How are we going to achieve that? What settings do we need? It was that complex in terms of priorities and stuff like that, to build the ULIB that along the same lines that Starby said, with the parametrics in there. But then, which elements of the system do you select? Which you want the missile to look out for, and how do you prioritize those? So I just felt it was really, really complex to do an effective plan at a simple level. And this is one of the benefits of the system. You could self-suppress a target. So, this is a kind of the limited combat ready level of training that all the squadrons did. You could put, as we had in the picture, on the picture behind me, you've got an outboard stub pylon with it's above the fuel tank. You could put your alarm there. You could have your self-protection missiles, be it ASRAAM or AIM-9 Lima, on the inboards, and your regular bomb load underneath the jet. So you could fire. You could ingress the target area, you could fire your alarms, then arc around the outskirts of the target area, waiting for the alarms to get to the impact point or to be established in the parachutes before you then turn in to deliver your own weapons. So, effectively, you were able to self-suppress to a degree. And I think that was a major strong point. Most people could do that kind of plan. But the seed, where you're offering support to a package, with the changing locations of the target, and try to make sure that you've got enough weapons over the target to provide the coverage during the TOT window of the strikers, becomes very complicated. But the strong points of the aircraft is that we had two sets of brains. I can be flying the aircraft, missing the ground, and staying out of a missile engagement zone, whilst the backseater is probably heads in a fair bit, manipulating the mission data to reflect a change in target location. And it is literally typing in lats and longs. So you can see that there's room for transcription errors, and so how do you translate your update from the RJ from the river joint, where the target, where the threat system is now moved to, then how do you, that might be described as a bullseye position. You got to then translate that into a lat and long and make sure you key it in correctly, so you can appreciate there's a lot of complexity involved there. I would say also that trying to get, even with pre-planned attacks, we do an attack preview where you go, okay, we've got the data downloaded to the missile, run a self-test on it. Does it look what we're expecting? We're expecting to fire at the back end of the basket because the threat is potent and we need to be able to then hide behind a hill and egress. Does it look like that? Does the iron bomb fire point this reversionary fire point, the planned fire point, does it look where it should in comparison to the markers for the basket? And it was not unusual to find that something had gone wrong in the plan. And then you have to go back and review the tapes, review the plan, and go, right, what went wrong, and kind of get to the bottom of that. And it wasn't unusual to need some weapons instructor input to validate that. So it's by no means as easy to use as I get the impression that Harm was, especially with the HTS and the kind of the automation of it. So I've talked about direct mode and loiter mode. Dual is effectively a hybrid of the two. Think of a situation where you fire the missile, it's heading towards the target. If it doesn't get the threat system emissions that it's looking for as its top priority, then it will then abort a direct attack and climb to height and deploy the parachute and then enter a loiter mode. So it's quite flexible, but you didn't get the same endurance in the parachute as a loiter. And perhaps if it was a later switch on from the threat system, then maybe if you fired a direct mode, that you would you would have the system come online and start transmitting towards the end of the time of flight, to the extent that the missile would then home on the target. So it was kind of like a compromise mode. So yeah, I think those are the kind of the main points. So I think as it's been alluded to, people didn't really know what we could do with it. So I think there's a surprise factor to the employment of the weapon. And as far as I know, it was definitely used in the first Gulf War. Second Gulf War, not quite so many missiles. Alarm 2, and again, it's hard to validate, was there a kill? I understand some systems went offline, but it's hard to quantify as to whether it was a hard kill or not. And that actually brings me on to just one other thing to do with the loiter mode. If you think about it, the missile's landing on a parachute, it's undamaged. So there's the potential for exploitation. So that's something to consider as well, isn't it? And one thing that we talked about offline that I'd just like to highlight is the whole rules of engagement thing. I remember Starbaby being really eloquent in his description about how his equipment could come up with range quality figures, and so you'd know where the emitter was. But one of the things that really struck me at the time with Alarm is getting the rules of engagement and the permissions to use it, because you might know where the threat system is relative to you, but what's nearby? Have the enemy set their missile systems up close to a primary school? Yeah, it's in violation of the law of armed conflict, but that never stopped anyone before. So I just felt it would need to be a full-on shooting war with the lawyers saying, yeah, just crack on, do what you need to do, before we'd be allowed to employ it. Because if you were to compare it with a standard attack that we might have planned and that we did plan, the lawyers got to enjoy having, right, what is the target construction? Where are you coming from? What are the impact conditions? What fragmentation is there going to be? And what's the pattern of life like? Are there going to be people there at the time? Is it rush hour, or is everyone in their bed when you're hitting this target? And then they can quite comfortably say the chances of killing non-combatants is virtually nil. So that's with a normal bomb. Well, if you change to firing an anti-radiation missile, you don't know fully where it's going to go, especially if the target location has changed. What's nearby? What if the weapon malfunctions, or if they switch off and the missile loses guidance? So I don't have answers to these questions, other than that there has to be appetite at the political level to shoulder this risk when you're employing weapons in this way, and you don't have the luxury of controlling the parameters and being able to predict the weapon's effects in the same way that you would for other pre-planned targeting that have gone on.
How did you, Nick? How did you? I can't remember how many were in the photo. It looked like the fit was 7. So was it 4 on the shoulder pylons and then 3 on the center pylons, or whatever they're called?
Yeah.
So
the under fuselage pylons we call the shoulder ones. So you could put 3 underneath there, and the stub pylons that were off the sides of the pylon holding the underwing tanks, you could fit them to either the outboard ones or the inboard or both. But to have self-protection in the form of an air-to-air missile, be it ASRAAM or an AIM-9 Lima, you would, if you're on a seed mission, generally speaking, be carrying 5. So 3 under the fuselage, and then 2 on the stubs with your self-protection missiles intact. But if you had fighter sweep, or you decided that you needed that many missiles, then clearly you could increase the loadout.
So how did you deconflict between the targets and what the missile was going to go after then? So if you take the sort of hanging in the parachute mode as an example, you've got 4, 5, 7 of these things hanging in parachutes over a given area of terrain, and as you said, that sort of area shrinks as it sort of the height up of the ground decreases. But let's say you've got 4 emitters in that area that you want to go after with those 7 missiles. How do you make sure that the first emitter that comes online doesn't get all 7 landing on its head?
Really good question. Yeah, I think it would be down to setting the priorities differently in each missile, and this is where it became massively complicated, because in the salvo you would have effectively what we call them sub-targets. So everything, you could have a whole cluster of sub-targets in the same area, and you could have fired the missiles targeting these different sub-targets from the same iron bomb fire point, the same reversionary fire point or planned fire point, and they would all be slightly different. So that would be the way that you would do it. However, we had loser plans, and any good attack pilot and air defense pilot will have a solid loser plan. What happens if we have fallout from a whole aircraft, like number 2 doesn't go, and if he was targeting a particular emitter, then you have to go, right, what are my priorities, and what was the pre-briefed or fallout from that? How would we reallocate these emitters? But you could also have problems with just individual missiles, and if you didn't have approval to fire in the degraded mode from the pre-planned fire point, then you would have to reduce the number of missiles that you would fire in the salvo. So yeah, even now I can just go, wow, yeah, this was the sort of thing you had to try and take into account, but only by changing the priorities against that individual sub-target could you stop missiles all biting off on the same emitter. And that's why it was really tough to come up with a plan, even when everything's working, let alone when stuff starts falling over. You get bad missiles, or you get an aircraft not make the push. So,
and as somebody who's definitely not schooled in the art of electronic warfare, I'm thinking about the pictures I see of radar signals, and I'm thinking about side lobes and that kind of thing, and then I'm thinking about this thing in the parachute and it's directly above it. So is it the side lobe that it's going to see? It's not going to be the main beam of a radar system?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that, but you're generally heading in the right sort of directions. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. No, that's fair enough. So, and what did the missile weigh then? I mean, it looks fairly sizable. I think Harm is like 1,000 pounds, or it's 1,000 pound class weapon. Is it the same thing?
I haven't looked this up, and I'm sorry. I'm going to go with something like 400 or 500 kilos. So yeah, more than an air-to-air missile, not as much as a bomb. I'm sorry, I can't be much more helpful than that. I'd have to Google it just like you. And actually, there's not a lot of information out there now. In preparation for this chat, I went onto the MBDA website. They don't declare it anymore, and you're just left with what you could find on Wikipedia. But it's reasonably hefty as missiles go, like any air-to-ground missile. But somewhere around, I'm going to go with somewhere like 400 or 500 kilos. Okay.
You previously described yourself, I think this is actually before we hit record, this is the first time we ever chatted, and you'd said, well, I'm interested in coming on, and but I got to be careful because all the QYs are going to say, what's this QFI doing, talking about weaponeering and stuff. Yeah. So you have your alibis there. But I just wondered then, from an employment point of view, if you think about the Wild Weasel mission as it is in the US Air Force, United States Navy, the US Armed Forces, and the schools and the level of sort of knowledge that's been built or was built over decades, and then you've got the RAF doing this for 25% of the time you were on 9 Squadron. did you have to learn a lot about the threat? Did you invite guys to do exchange tours with you who were coming from Weasel platforms in the US? What sort of, I mean, how much did you have to know about the Weaseling mission?
I do not think in all honesty, we were a patch on the CJs, and so yeah, sorry guys, that's my honest opinion. You know, for my colleagues, I don't want to sort of talk us down, but I just think we didn't do it enough. We had good information, you know, as you would imagine any nation would have the best available information on threat systems and stuff like that. I don't think we trained often enough to, like, if we had a build up, and we did some exercises in Germany with the Luftwaffe and their ECRs and stuff like that. It's like anything, the more you do it, the better you get. And I do understand the CJs do have to do you know, some air-to-air stuff. It's part of their force protection role, so I guess they have to swing away from the pure harm bit, and you have to obviously come back to this stuff often enough. So yeah, I don't think we did it enough. In terms of exchanges, the exchange between the Tornado force as a generic and the US Armed Forces generally was with the EA6. So it was more with the jamming side of things. And that's another interesting thing to say about the way the RAF structured its squadrons, in terms of, we had EWOs and EYs, but EYs were the kind of subject matter experts, but really think of them as being experts in the aircraft DAS. So the jamming pods, the RHWR and things like that. And obviously, you know, when it came to running a plan, you'd certainly ask your EYs about, to just kind of give us a brief key points about the threat that you were, whose MES you were planning to penetrate. But when I heard the stories, you know, of Star Baby's EY training, or electronic warfare officer training, it sounded in a much greater depth than we did. And I think so that probably places the RAF's attempt at Seed/Deed in a proper context. I think perhaps we realised that we weren't in the same league as those guys, and maybe as a result, we're not going to brag and talk up our capability that perhaps we couldn't back up with, you know, and deliver on. But I think, you know, as I said, really, I think that the main benefit, we could surprise the enemy and say, look, we can do this. And there were some systems we had a very good capability against, and that would have been an unpleasant surprise to those operators on the enemy side. But I think in that situation, recognise that, you know, talk to your CJ and your Prowler guys, say, look, okay, this is how we can help. You know, do you want it? You know, we can offer that, and if nothing else, and in these modern days where you've got double-digit SAMs, you're forcing them maybe to engage the missiles, the alarm, rather than the strike package. You might be able to run them out of missiles for that, or bring out some other novel capabilities to chip away at the SA, doing something unusual, something different. You know, I think it always would get SAM operators' attention if warheads are detonating close by, and they think, "What the hell was that?" You know. So I think that's really what we had to offer.
Maybe you've already answered this question when you talk about, you know, being able to self-suppress. You mentioned the original ambition behind Alarm being corridor suppression during the Cold War, and I guess most people listening to this will be able to understand or imagine that scenario. So what was the new imaginary sort of scenario then for Alarm when you were there then? Just the self-suppression, or did you think, well, if there's a big ATO, we're definitely going to be called in on to go and hit some SAMs somewhere in the theatre of operations?
I think that the majority of it was likely to be self-suppression. The challenging thing with moving the target location was that we would superimpose the iron bomb fire point on the sub target where the missile was located. So instead of having this conventional display, we would just fire off a range, and that way you could move things around. And obviously that might compromise your ingress in terms of making the best use of terrain and radar shadow and things like that. Mm-hmm. In terms of threat systems, you know, generically it'd be like a single-digit formal Soviet Union / Warsaw Pact, and some of the export French systems / legacy American systems that have been exported around various parts of the world. So that's the sort of stuff we were generally training to. And I think, the self-suppression stuff would be, I think, the main thing that we could offer to the package. And of course, the other thing you'd have to deconflict that with other operators and, clear avenues of fire. Well, you need to make sure people aren't above you because the missile would climb to height. You can't have that going through somebody's height block if they're in front of you. You'd want to make sure that you had a clear field of fire for that.
Yeah. Maybe again, this is another one you've already answered by absence of information rather than by things you have said. But Harm is well known to have a Harm as sensor mode where you can pull up what the seeker is seeing and use that to find and target sensors. It also has a target of opportunity mode and a self-protection mode. Did you have any of those sorts of capabilities?
No. Really, it was a case of that we could interface with the missile, download the coordinates to it, and check that link was working, but we didn't really get any indication of what the seeker was seeing while the missile was still on the aircraft. From what I can remember, there was a button press that would happen about 15 seconds to launch, which would trigger the thermal battery in the missile itself, and that was the first time then the rest of the missile was being powered. So the power that it got from the aircraft wasn't for the whole missile at that point, as I can recall anyway. So no, we didn't have any of those things. So self-defense would be where you maybe worked out the range at which you could abort your target and turn away at high G and out and kinematically defeat the missile, as long as their missile is fired from the position you're expecting it to be. So if they've moved it even a mile closer to you, it looks like it's on the same azimuth, and you fired you get the spike, you get the indications of being locked up. And you think, oh yeah, it's where it's at. It's the brave person that's going to press on into your fire point and go, no, I can outstick him, or I can at least get my weapon away, because he might just be on the same azimuth but closer to you. And so that's the only sort of self-protection you would get, as if it was the site that you were targeting that had fired at you, but nothing like the integration that's on the CJ.
Were your tolerances, I mean, it might have been an arbitrary number you just gave, but 1 mile, but were your tolerances for threat reactions and things like that and the self-protection capability, were they really that tight?
We could do some limited modelling at our level, at squadron level, with a threat system and work out it was a generic platform rather than specifically the Tornado, but you could put the sort of parameters that were reflective of our capability into it. But no, I don't honestly recall, and I think it would be like Defence of the Homeland, where you were going to be starting to call the differences in where it's pitched up compared to where you thought it was going to be a mile. Okay, I'm gonna press in and because it's not like an air defense fighter with a PD radar, and you can actually see where the enemy is, where he's firing at you. There's no lag from AWACS or anything else. It's real-time information. You can see exactly where they're at. And even then, it's a bold person that decides to go, right, I'm going to abort at this range, and now I'm going to see the missile just drop short of my canopy. I don't think anyone's going to do that. So no, there wasn't really any kind of formal tolerances. The simple answer to your question.
Tell us then a little bit about Brimstone. That's the missile that's hanging off at a jaunty angle on those.
So I chose this picture because this, I think, is one of the fits that could conceivably have been used for destruction of enemy air defences. So the legacy Brimstone was originally designed for targeting armoured vehicles and tanks in column, effectively, or in a sort of formation as employed by the former Soviet Union. So obviously it's still in service, and I can't remember too much about it, but I think in terms of destruction of enemy air defences, benefits of carrying Brimstone would be and you would choose to carry it potentially where the threat systems you were aiming to target were mounted on chassis, like the SA-6 gainful, and the straight flush radar, that's all track chassis, generically, without, I'm not kind of giving away too much. It's an armored vehicle, isn't it, basically? So, the seeker would be potentially have a capability against that. And the beauty is you don't have to overfly the target. Before that, and before the UK took cluster munitions, cluster bombs, specifically BL-755 or IBL-755, out of the inventory because of the mines issue and the treaty there. That would have been a weapon of choice. But one thing that I can really say, I did an exercise in Germany in the Hohenfels range, and we knew where the system was. It was an SA-6 radar, straight flush radar, and I could only positively idea at the last moment. It had camouflage netting on. It was in the open. It wasn't like it was in woods as you would expect to find, in perhaps Ukraine or whatever else. So again, a big shout out to the guys who flew the F-105 and were doing Iron Hand missions and stuff like that. How, in the face of the handheld small arms like AAA, SAMs, how they got kills. I mean, they even strafed these sites. How they did that is just cojones, the size of, watermelons, I have to say. And it's so hard to get an ID. If that's the requirement, POS ID of the target from the rules of engagement, really late to get that. And that's, and I wasn't even being shot at, and I knew where it was. So the target bars pitched up bang on where it was. And even then at the last minute, oh yeah, it's an SA-6. They could only just, the radar. So the benefit of the Brimstone would be that you could at least loft the alarms into the area. They are established or have impacted, maybe forcing the threat system to shut down, and then you've maybe arced around the target area until they've impacted or in the parachutes, and then turn in to fire the Brimstone. But you wouldn't have to overfly the target. So that's a beauty, given that you probably have troopers with SA-14, SA-18, and any other handheld SAMs and light AAA around the system that you're trying to hit and they're trying to protect. So that's kind of why I put it on there, because in terms of the other weapons we might use, it'd be a PGM in terms of like a GPS guided weapon. Can you get accurate enough coordinates? Obviously the capabilities of the rivet joint and Nimrod R1 still, highly classified. But how do you communicate that? How do you, even if you're talking about it, reference a bullseye or something like that, depending on how far away the bullseye is, your angular errors could be quite significant, and you don't have to miss by much before the fragmentation is, going to have no effect on the radar dish or something like that. And obviously we saw Star Baby take down the Mosul SA-3, and that was because you could do that from medium level, and all the stuff we're talking about really is low level. That was really what we trained to, low level self-suppression, low level seed. Of course, if we had gone into the medium level environment, then we maybe would have done the same thing that he did on the day, but in no way did we train to that. It just seemed barking mad to be flying in, trying to deliver a PGM straight and level with our platform and its maneuverability in a MES that you may be suppressed or maybe not.
So if I understand this correctly, and I think you mentioned Brimstone briefly in our last episode, you talked about it having the capability, and you've kind of inferred again the same, to look at a scene and pick a target. So was it as simple as just ripple firing that into, towards a set of coordinates, or did you have to point it at something, get it to recognize it was there, hand it off to the missile, and then it goes off the rails?
No, you would. It was going to coordinates, and the missile can have search areas defined, and that helps. So it gets to the end of the area, and then maybe it's going to self-destruct or stuff like that. So it's not. You don't get indications of what the seeker is seeing, because quite often the seeker may be starting to look after it's left the aircraft. So again, it becomes hard to quantify whether you have achieved the effects that you were looking for. It might only be after the event that they replay the tapes from the RJ or the whatever EW asset you've got there and go, yeah, he was transmitting, and no, he's not. And that coincides roughly with the impact of the missile. So and BDA, recce of the area by national assets or TAC recce air assets. So that's it's hard to quantify, as has been highlighted by Star Baby and other people, really.
It's a cool missile. We were talking before we hit record about somebody we both know. He showed me tapes of Brimstone. They were unclassified, but he couldn't release them to me because they were proprietary. But they were from tests in Nevada, and they showed the missile. So they had an ATV and they had a rubber dummy or something, a blow-up doll, whatever it was, on the back of it. It's a radio-controlled ATV.
Yeah.
And the missile had been obviously programmed to take out the driver. So that was the level of sophistication they got to, that it wasn't just the vehicle or the truck or the the general locality, get a sort of an indirect sort of weapons effect type thing. It was the missile was able to identify the rubber dummy on the back of the thing and hit him, which I thought was impressive.
Yeah, I can't comment on that level. It might have been something particular to that trial, but I can say that when I first got to the squadron, 31 were the subject matter experts. So that's the jet behind me, the 31 squadron, also based at Marham. They were the experts on the what I'll call the legacy Brimstone, and that was really designed, again, Cold War requirement, to be able to take on advancing Soviet or pack motor rifle divisions without overflying them. Salve off missiles, they go into the search pattern of a particular geometry and engage them autonomously. Kind of felt that we weren't going to see rules of engagement that were going to allow that, because again, what level of certainty have you got that the seeker is going to recognize military vehicle or not bite off on a pickup truck as a civilian vehicle as a military vehicle and engage that instead? But the major step forward really was when we got dual mode seeker Brimstone, so DMS Brimstone. That was an excellent weapon to have because it gave you a moving target capability or capability against the moving targets. And so what you are identifying really is that, yes, the missile could engage with great precision and using a warhead that was designed to take on a military, armored vehicle, so explosively formed projectiles and things like that. So it's going to go through your average Toyota Hilux, which is favoured by Daesh or any other insurgents of choice. It's going to go through that like a knife through hot butter, and but there's relatively little or no fragmentation, so you get the kill, kinematically speaking, from the molten metal slug going through your Hilux at high velocity, and it's going to take care of everyone inside. But in terms of collateral damage, there's next to nothing. So up until that point, we've been relying either on strafe or various workarounds with a laser guided bomb. And I generally say that I felt the US JTACs were squeamish about using us because everyone else is carrying around 500-pound class weapons, and we are carrying 1,000-pound class weapon. The UK enhanced Paveway 2, so GBU 34, or I'm a bit fuzzy on the numbers, but yeah, think of a Paveway 2. So 1,000-pound class weapon, LGB head, and GPS guidance. So they're seeing twice the weight, they're thinking twice the frag, twice the collateral damage risk, and generally speaking, they didn't favour using us for that reason. I've even had situations where they'd rather use their own artillery. I'm going, why are we even here? Why are we even here? We talked about giving our bombs air experience because people would, we were favoured assets for doing shows of force and stuff like that because learn fast is what we did, and the targeting pod was great with the rover link, but yeah, they were a bit squeamish about our weapons. I know I've dived down a rabbit hole here, sorry about that.
No, that's a good one, because I was going to ask about that anyway. I wrote an article on the Tornado years ago for one of the magazines, and I'd written in there about a data modem that the Tornado had. This was the GR1 pre-GR4 days, so special forces could set a laser designator on the ground, walk away, be out of the area, and the Tornado could trigger the laser designator to designate and then drop a bomb on it. And I had some air commodore from somewhere furiously demanding to know who had told me that, and so on and so forth. But it wasn't secret. It wasn't classified. It was just not something that was talked about very much. But I wondered, you've just mentioned ROVER, which is a data link. I don't think we've talked about that yet.
No.
And you've talked about low-level shows of force. Did you do any work with special forces guys? What were you because and you might not want to answer that, which is fine. But I'm just curious to know sort of if you weren't really sort of in demand from US JTACs, were you supporting Brits on the ground, Aussies on the ground? What were you doing?
I just think what I've highlighted is they were squeamish about employing weaponry from us, I think, and we made concerted efforts to brief them on the weapon we had and the fact that if they had their figures for danger close for the US class weapons, they need to make sure they used ones that were specific to our weapon, because the bomb body is different, the forging might be different, the frag pattern's different, and to highlight, look, it's not twice the frag, it's not twice the collateral damage risk just because it's twice the weight. That doesn't mean jack really. But I mean, no, we were still used, and the whole principle of a lot of the operations over Iraq post the Second Gulf War was having on-call CAS. It was called XCAS, and that so anywhere in the area of Iraq, if there were troops in contact, that they could have an air asset overhead within a given period of time. 20 minutes seems to ring a bell. So there were obviously certain hotspots, and where those were, we would be doing, Overwatch. And now that could be, as you talked about the rover downlink, the beauty could be that there would be a JTAC or forward air controller in a headquarters, and he can see our rover feed as we go around various sites that have been used historically by the enemy, by insurgents. So it was possible they would go back to these places. So, they got us doing something useful whilst being on call rather than just droning around. I certainly felt that there was a deterrence effect from hearing, fast jets overhead. And that was something I really tried to use. So I can remember I had a friend who was on the ground in Basra, for example, and, I'd maybe come off task and go to the tanker in one of the orbits not far away, take on gas. But the first pass I did, I'd make sure I was going fast over the whole of Basra. So you get over the whole of the city going, look, if you're thinking of doing something unpleasant, think again, because we're here. And I understand that there was a considerable feeling of reassurance that we were overhead from the troops on the ground in Basra, to hear that sound, to know that they've got somebody watching out over them, in that way. So yeah, the rover link was excellent for the JTAC to be able to say, or pan left a little bit, what's go up, what's that, or you can just agree that is something hostile and worth engaging. He can give you clearance based on what he can see. And if you were to compare that rover link feed from our Lightning 3 pod, the Rafael Lightning 3, with the tiled, the resolution was just so much better. We had to be a lot lower with tiled, and if you also include, I think you've alluded to this when you've been talk about being in the sim in the Tornado, some of the TV screens in the back seat were very old and the resolution was pretty poor. So it doesn't matter how good the targeting pod is, if you're still looking at them at the feed through a 1970s TV type screen, you're going to struggle to break out the point of interest or the target. It might be blazingly obvious when you look at the tape feed on our debriefing ground station. Why couldn't you see it? Well, we had sun on the screen and it's 1970s TV screen, but we got AMLCD screens in the back seat, and that really helped with the resolution. But the Lightning 3 had brought so many capabilities, not least the rover link. So yeah, I think we were popular with all the coalition partners, JTACs, not least because we were also allowed to operate as singletons, which is something the F-16s couldn't do. We had approval to do that, so we could split assets and we'd join up again if there was a troops in contact situation. But I like to think that we are flexible. We, in terms of all the customers, we really wanted them to come up with what effect do you want from us. So without going into too many details, some of the customers would want Overwatch without a covert Overwatch, for example. So you didn't want to be so close that you're dropping noise on an area. So if their customers are doing something and they want the element of surprise, you don't want a jet noise orbiting. If you were on the ground, you go, "What's that? Somebody's circling over the top." Does that mean if they weren't doing that before, is something about to happen? You could be spoiling somebody's surprise. So it's just important, and I think it's a doctrine that the Air Force still follow, and I think it's a great one. It's like, what effect do you want? You tell us what effect you want. We can tell you what we're carrying that can give that effect and give you a range of options, perhaps. And so, yeah, that's the way I kind of felt it. It was some frustration that we felt that perhaps there was some reticence to employ the weapons we were carrying, and I think it was really down to lack of knowledge on their part.
This is post 2003, obviously. Because that's so. The nature of the enemy changed after that, didn't it? I mean, so Saddam Hussein was one thing. So you had flown the no-fly zone, doing response options. You talked about that in detail last time, and I think I asked you about the idea of getting shot down or being captured or anything like that, and how that impacted you, and whether your family were worried and that kind of thing. One of the things that's characteristic of talking to people who flew in Afghanistan and Iraq in those years was, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, the fact that if you were captured in those days, at that point, you were definitely going to be starring in your own, homemade movie. Whereas, you might have stood a chance if Saddam Hussein's bunch had captured you. So I'll repeat the question. When it comes to flying as a singleton then, over Iraq in post 2003, with all those foreign fighters coming in and their jihadi sort of objectives, did that give you pause for thought? Did you have? I mean, do you push it from your mind? Do you think the Tornadoes? I think about the F-15. So the F-15 has some pretty stringent asymmetric maneuvering limitations, and we saw in 2011, I think there was an F-15E that went down over Libya. GBU-12 came off the aeroplane. He maneuvered the aeroplane asymmetrically, and the aeroplane departed control flight. They had to punch out,
right?
And they got rescued, I think, by CIA guys on the ground in Libya. They got very lucky. So, but do you think about that? Do you force the possibilities from your mind, or do you embrace it and say, well, this is going to be my plan? And do you even go as far as considering what you would do if you're going to be captured? Do you take your own life, or I hope this doesn't sound like a silly question, but
no, not at all. No, you often ask the kind of really thoughtful questions like that, which gets to the nub of the issue. So we were not fighting Daesh at the time, to be clear. I think that the people that I thought were most akin to that would be Muqtada al-Saddah's group. So if we were flying around the eastern side of Baghdad, Sada City, that's an area where we thought that these people would be. And coming down somewhere around there would be suboptimal. I think we probably still had more value alive than dead. So whereas the Daesh, I think, are more likely to just as you say, make a video, with one ending to it. And I think generally speaking, before the first mission, you've got your head full of all the induction briefs and the various special instructions, the CSAR procedures and things like that you would follow. So I think I might have said this before, I never slept that well before that first mission. But after that, it's amazing how things can become routine. I can't, confess to it now, but I think I got about 1 hour's sleep before going. But, I just thought, well, the guys on the ground are getting next to no sleep. I'm not going to go, I'm sorry, I didn't sleep last night. I'm not going to go, no, you're going to go and do the business. And I slept like a baby the next night, and that was no problem. And once you're into the flow of things, then it became fairly normal. I think when I understand people like John Peters and John Nichol had a chat about what they would do if they got shot down, and then obviously got confronted with that situation, and the weapon jammed. I mean, we were still flying when I was operational with the Walther PPK, which is a pop gun. As far as pistols go, you're better off throwing the weapon at the enemy than trying to employ it as a weapon system. So I just kind of thought, well, I'm going to do my best. I think you have to cultivate a bit of warrior spirit, honestly, and go. So I did carry extra knives and stuff with me, but just stuff I could fold up, put in my pocket. but my mindset was to know my procedures, know my survival equipment, to do the best I could and fly smart. I always felt that if I flew smart, that was going to be fine. I think we also had the benefit of having two engines rather than just the single engine on the Viper. And I did have engine failures. I had a mechanical failure in the Basra area, and had to shut the engine down and fire the extinguisher into both engine bays in case it had gone into an uncontained fire and titanium fire and things like that, and diverted into Basra. So, but the rest of the time, I don't think I know for sure we didn't lose an airplane over either Iraq or Afghanistan through failures. So it's a tribute to our engineers, but also a tribute to the fact you got two engines, which is better than one if you were to have a failure.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the GR4 cockpit? So you just talked about the TV screens in the back.
Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned it in the last episode or if we were just talking about it offline, but you have talked about the wide field head-up display.
Yeah.
You also had did you have an MFD replacing the
we did.
moving map?
Yeah. So to compare the GR1 with the GR4, the GR1 had an old fashioned microfiche type map, so you could go off map and that was it. The GR4 had a digital moving map, and you had a track line overlaid, which is from the mission materials from the main computer. So that was good. And then we got updates that would allow us to see a simplified weapon status page to see if, we were talking about the status of the alarm missiles, where you could see if it was a full up missile that passed all its self tests, or whether it had a problem. And we had ways of seeing the status of other laser guided bombs, the EP2 and later the PV4. And that's important because you can then see what the issue is and then go, right, of my loser plan, if I had a bad bomb, how does that affect the targeting? What are the priority designated points of impact? So that was great. And then later we got a software update that allowed us to see the targeting pod picture, and I think that was brilliant. I would characterize overall that a lot of the workload was in the back seat of the Tornado, but as the weapons became more complex, I think the back seat became swamped, and more and more information came forward into the front seat. I think we, as front seaters, we're generally slightly envious of the Strike Eagle, where I felt, as far as we understood it, and then of course that may be inaccurate, but we felt that they had access to everything. Everyone could see everything, and I think that's a real strong point. I think there was a reticence initially for too much information to come through to the front seat because, at the risk of speaking for my backseat brothers and sisters, they felt that we should be looking out, and they'd be right. But there's a time and a place. I think that the way around this quandary is training and having SOPs that are robust to say, right, at certain phases, everyone is not looking at the targeting screen picture. There's no point in having two sets of eyes, and both sets of eyes are on the targeting pod picture, and nobody's looking out for missiles or threat aircraft. So broadly speaking, the hardware of the airplane didn't really change. So flight control systems all the same. The air-to-air missile integration was the same, and suboptimal in certain areas. Terrain following radar was the same. It was more avionics and information display, but the HOTAS allowed us to sequence the multifunctional display through different pages, so you could toggle through the targeting pod to the weapon status page and things like that. And we could also update the steering of the airplane, which was a real core navigator stroke backseater's job. And you could annoy them, not setting out to do that, but you could step the steering on, which for a single pilot operator would be like, this is required, it's part of the job. But it could affect their displays, what the time early late is saying. But sometimes the vagaries of the system would be that it would step onto the next waypoint when you didn't want it to. So, front seater could solve it a lot quicker with one rock of a castle switch, when the back seater would have to go nav, dest, waypoint, bring the correct waypoint to line, and then hit a steering button on the nav, on the nav kind of like a hard key. So it was a lot quicker for us to do it. And it just comes back to CRM and training and SOPs. yeah, everyone's got information. It's better, but recognize when it's better for one person to be eyes out and the other person eyes in.
Did you feel that you mentioned the Strike Eagle and you talked about, you know, the guys in the front and girls in the front having access to everything, which is my understanding too. But how did you feel about the Tornado as an aeroplane that you were flying? So the reason I ask is that, you know, it's been said to me more than once that the RAF is a first-rate Air Force flying second-rate equipment. You know, was it something that you were proud to fly? I mean, I you know, of course you're going to be proud to fly for your nation and in the defense of your nation and be a fast jet pilot and wearing RAF wings, you know, the brevet. But was it something that, you know, you thought, God, actually wouldn't mind getting on an exchange, going and flying the Strike Eagle in Seymour Johnson for 3 years or whatever? How did you feel about it?
Yeah, I think we were aware of the platform's limitations. I think our strong points were being flexible, adaptable, you know, and we had to be because the platform wasn't the strongest in terms of pure aircraft performance. We had some unique capabilities, but I can remember, for example, maybe it was more on my first tour because we were still doing some paper planning. But if you can imagine getting a retask, a change to the reconnaissance tasking, there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth because we would have the Ordnance Survey style maps, so 1 to 50 thou maps with various different mapping datums and plotting the recce runs we were going to do, and they changed the tasking. It was very mandrolic, and we basically shredded everything. So we felt that we were well behind at that point in terms of the planning and integration of the system. But we subsequently got Tampa, which was the Tornado Advanced Mission Planning Aid, and it was a variant of the system that the Harriers had got first, I think. So things improved rapidly. You know, our ability to replan and do stuff more reactively was greatly enhanced by having Tampa, and that change had happened whilst I was away as an instructor at TAC Weapons between 2000 and 2003. But you know, I think we did ourselves proud. I think with restraint. There were times when we're flying with a targeting pod that, you know, it's been highlighted that if there's cloud in the target area, that can affect the contrast tracking of a targeting pod. And if you've got weapons in the air and the pod starts to become destabilized, then the chances are, if it's a pure laser guided weapon, that's going to miss. And I'm proud to say that there were times, we didn't drop, but then when we did drop, we hit the target. But there were other coalition assets that were dropping, and the weapons were going astray because of the weather. Now, of course, there are other modes that you can use, and we had a ground stabilized mode that you could say, okay, it's not going to track on the contrast anymore. It's going to stabilize on a point on the ground, and hopefully the cloud will move out of the way, and then you can go back to tracking the target image or the contrast of it. But I'm proud to say that we exercise restraint, and you know, shot discipline is a really important part of being a fast jet aviator, fighter aviator, in whichever seat, and sticking to the ROE and stuff like that. But yeah, I think we did look with envy at things like the Strike Eagle as a platform. You know, we say, how can we improve the Tornado? I know, let's put bigger engines in it, another fin, an air-to-air radar. Oh God, wait a minute, that's a Strike Eagle, isn't it? You know, but you know, we spent a lot of its operational life at medium level, and that's a place it was never designed to be. You know, it's a high wing loader, high bypass engines, so you needed it to use the reheat to get some of the performance. But you know, if you're at night, that's not tactically sound. But we did the best we could, because that's what the RAF always does. We'll improvise, we'll try our best to deliver with what we have to hand at the time.
When we talked, I think the first time we talked, which was not, we weren't recording, we were just chatting, saying hello to each other. I think you said to me there were some things that you were, you wanted to share around, the learning experiences and the things that could have been done better. And is that now a good time to do that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of alluding to kind of forced culture, and so my experience coming through as an ab initio on my first tour and subsequently was that the evaluations were always a step beyond what you were trying to do. So the phrase mission qualification training, I think, is the one the US Air Force uses, isn't it? When somebody arrives on a squadron, and is becoming declared combat ready, and that's the phrase we use in the RAF. Well, the combat ready assessment sortie was leading an opposed pair, so a 2v1 with a Red Baron or an aggressor aircraft out there. But the qualification you're going to give that person is wingman. And so we're always testing above at the next level. So I think that the phrase they use, we're looking for a tactical wingman but domestic leader. So for example, if your leader had battle damage, you could lead them back for a pairs approach, or could lead them back safely and sensibly in a domestic sense, rather than sort of necessarily a tactical sense. But we're always evaluating people at that higher level. And when I got my first weapon away, I was a wingman, and I was leading a 4-ship, supervised by everyone else, and it was a very simple profile. But I don't think that's right. But the thing was, at the time in the culture, you certainly didn't want to go, no, I don't want to do that. You want to get down with the cool kids and get your badge, your combat ready badge, and to be part of the squadron. And you're not going to turn away from a challenge. So you're going to step up and do your best. And of course, the standard required changed. So if you're for a given mission leading an opposed pair, if you're qualifying as a wingman, they'd have a given standard. But if you were getting your pair's lead qualification, then the standard obviously would be, because you'd be going to war as the leader of a pair, then clearly you have to be doing a better job as befits that qualification. But I talked to, in the build up to our interviews, to a friend of mine who has experience on the air defense version of the Tornado, albeit limited because he didn't pass his combat ready workup as a Wizzo, as a backseater, came on to the Tornado GR as a Wizzo, then was a patch wearer, and then crossed over as a pilot, but didn't keep his patch wearer qualification. He's got the knowledge, but he didn't do the course in the front seat, and he's now flying the Typhoon. And so my question to him was, okay, we could always mix people up. So my first operational tour, I was flying with a highly experienced weapons school graduate backseater. So yeah, he's looking after me and mentoring me, keeping me in the straight and narrow. That's great. But what do you do when you don't have that anymore? Everyone's single seat. Yes, you've got obviously cross cockpit supervision between the aircraft. And the answer is it's much more a building block approach, which is exactly how the US Air Force, and as I understand, the US Navy has been doing it for years. So I hold my hand up at this point and say, this is very much my nature. I'm very systematic, and I like to see people get good training, to receive good training that builds up gradually, and you consolidate and achieve levels before moving on. But I just don't feel that it was like that at the time. There are lots of great people, all doing their best, and we delivered when it mattered. But that was just part of the culture, that it was always the level above. And I did Red Flag Mission Command on my second tour, and I hadn't regained my pairs lead status, let alone my fours lead status. So you can imagine I was quite daunted. I had done the tactical leadership program with NATO, so I had led large force employment, cameos and stuff like that, and planned them and things like that in a NATO environment. But that was 3 years prior. That was whilst I was on my first tour, before I was a tactical weapons instructor. But we're on Red Flag, and they say, Nick, do you want to have a go at Mission Command? Yeah, I think. I didn't get a lot of sleep that week. Let's put it that way. The nerves were considerable. But I flew with an experienced backseater. He really stepped up. He was great. And yeah, it was, it was okay. It was probably not going to set the world on fire as leads go. And I was working with some great guys. I can remember talking to the OCA lead. He was an F-15C guy, and he was on his workup. But I just think they had people at a more appropriate stage of their qualifications doing this stuff. So it was very much a go in at the deep end, and it's quite traumatic. But we muddled through and did a reasonable job. I just think I know they don't do it that way anymore. And my friend speaks very highly of how things are done now, and how you really have to earn your spurs. Because being a wingman, a good wingman, is not easy. Being in the right place, initiating the turns at the right place. As the leader, you obviously you're a stable platform, but you are making kind of longer range decisions. And in some ways, yes, as long as you're stable, it's the wingman's job to stay visual, to stay in formation, call as fuel to you and stuff like that. But the RAF always had people as thinking wingmen, making maybe more empowered than I perceive some of the other nations, to the extent that when they went on exchange, they were kind of chirping up with helpful stuff, and they eventually had to realize, they got told to shut up, shut up, and I want to hear 2 on the check-in, bingo, out of fuel, and lead, I think you're on fire, because you don't know. And they had to learn their place and just really fit in, just wingman, be a wingman. And then my friend talks about this kind of having to make this adaptation to being single seat and how things now run, as I understand it. But I would be, I'm sorry if I've offended any of my former colleagues by being as honest and perhaps critical about it in this forum, but and I would hold my hand up and say I'm a very systematic guy, and I do like my nickname or call sign on my first tour was Spock. You can probably get an idea why. It didn't really stick, but that was my call sign on my first tour. But having been an instructor, it works really well. You give people the phase brief, they do the simulator, and then you do objective-based training airborne. And as you make sure that just because you've had exposure to the objective, exposure is not necessarily competence, and you might need some more sorties, some consolidation. But if you get that right and you get the foundations in place, then you've got a more capable operator. So yeah, that's a brutally honest Nick's version of how things were.
What does what does he say now happens then? So it is now more building block.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very much so. Yeah. He said that pairs and fours lead stuff, it's a really big step up in terms of the complexity and the number of decisions to be made. One of the things people who are 2-seat operators don't fully appreciate, and I got a little bit of insight into it with being an instructor where I was single pilot and a solo student who was single pilot. You're getting a feel for their SA from the tone of their voice. Are their radio calls standard? Are they made at the right point? Or are there pauses? Do they sound stressed? That there's all sorts of SA you can pick up over the radio and from other things. And are they flying the aircraft on speed? Is it, if the SOP speed is 420 knots, are they on speed? Or are they climbing and slowing down because they're not sure where they are, which is what people sometimes do. If you're map and stopwatch in poor weather and are not certain of your position. So he talked about how when he was fairly new to the platform, there was just he was in a 4-ship, he was number 2, I think, and then the number 3 as an element leader told him to climb into this block, flow back to cap and reset. He just got a sense that my friend's SA had just kind of dipped a bit, and he needed to get back out, simplify everything, rebuild SA, and then recommit with full SA and a good picture. And I just think that's amazing. That's such a high level of cooperation and awareness of how your team are operating and being able to influence things from some subtle cues that people who've flown, including myself, mostly 2-seat guys, go, CRM in a single-seat world, that's like an oxymoron, doesn't exist. And you see a lot of airline pilots go, you single-seat fast jet mates, don't know anything about CRM. Au contraire, Blackadder. There's a lot, as I've highlighted, and it's a lot more nuanced than they fully appreciate. So,
tell us about something that isn't nuanced then. Your ejection.
Right. Yes. You often ask about memorable sorties. So yeah. So the background to the sortie, I have left the front line. I am an instructor pilot up on the Tornado conversion units. So I, as an instructor pilot, would do the ab initio. So first tour guides, conversion to the aircraft type, but I would also do check rides, as I had done on the frontline squadrons, check rides on pilots every year. So there was a day check, a night check by day, a night check as well, and also the instrument flying test. And so that sort of stuff would be done in a trainer variant of the Tornado. So we haven't really alluded to that. I mean, the difference is really it's just one TV screen slightly offset. We've got replicated controls in the back seat, so stick, throttles, wing sweep. We could only drop the gear by the blowing it down on the emergency system, and we had some override switches on the thrust reverse. But there was enough. I could land the airplane from the back seat, and we practiced that occasionally. But for the rest of it, it was the trainer version was often used if we were short of assets on our frontline squadron, and it was also something that could be used not on a war role, but if you're on peacetime training, you needed the airframe to make up the numbers. You would still use the trainer aircraft. So the sortie profile was one of these acceptance checks. It was a pilot check on somebody who'd come off the front line and was joining the conversion unit as a staff pilot, and he had some leave, having come back from an operational deployment and hadn't flown for a while. Generically, the sortie profile involved a bit of low level, a trip to the weapons range for some delivery profiles, including the toss attack I talked about in one of the previous episodes. That's kind of a handling exercise, and also made up part of the instrument rating test. So we did some of that. We did some of the high angle of attack handling that we talked about with the spin prevention and incidence limiting system. We do swept approach, and then into the circuit for doing degraded flight control system work and single engine circuits. Well, say single engine with the one engine throttle back to idle. So the sortie had progressed normally. We're getting towards the end of it, and we've rejoined the circuit, having done the swept approach to overshoot. And we turned downwind and he puts the gear down. In the Tornado, when the gear goes down, it goes through a self-test. It's got two gains, one high gain for taxiing in on the ground where you need a wider deflection on the nose wheel. I think it's plus or minus 60 degrees from memory, but clearly that's too much on the takeoff roll and landing roll. So a low gain is automatically selected when you put the gear down. But once the gear's gone down, it goes through a test, and we got a warning that it hadn't gone through the test, and so the drills reflected trying to ascertain if the nose wheel was straight or whether it was kind of cocked off to the side. So I put a pan call out to air traffic control, and that really just alerted them that something was slightly amiss, and they stood to the fire services. And we called downwind for the option of either a full stop landing or a touch and go. So the procedure was to fly a normal circuit, lower the nose wheel onto the runway. Normally, compressing the nose wheel oleo would bring everything to life. The nose wheel steering would engage in low mode, and you would complete a landing. If the nose wheel steering system didn't come to life and it's effectively free casting, you'd go around again, stay in the closed pattern, leave the gear down, and then drop the hook and land into the approach end cable. It was the best way, if there's no nose wheel steering, to stop the aeroplane that way. If you're using thrust reverse and the nose wheel steering is not engaged and the nose wheel is free casting, you could have some challenges maintaining directional control, because you're really just left with the rudder and then differential braking. So in that situation, if you didn't have a cable available to you, for example, diverting to a civilian airport, then you would use aerodynamic braking down to about 100 knots, and then just try your best to keep it on the runway with the rudder and differential braking. So we call turning finals for the option, and we touch down, lower the nose wheel, and it comes to life. So it's all good. Also, I thought, and so at this point, I'll share the screen and show you a bit about the Tornado and the thrust reverse and how it can affect the directional control of the aircraft. So this is a picture of the aircraft on the ground with the thrust reverse buckets deployed. Slightly artificial, because you would never have the air brakes, which are appear out at the same time. There was an interlock that if the air brakes were out and you deployed the thrust reverser, that the air brakes would stow automatically. So with the Tornado, the brakes are rubbish. The primary stopping aid really was the thrust reverse. You could stop on the brakes, but they would likely overheat and either lose effectiveness or overheat the tyres to the extent that a fusible plug would blow and the tyres deflate. So with that in mind, after vacating the runway, the SOP was to split the throttles. The gearbox logic would see that as an engine failure and close a clutch that could link the two gearboxes before shutting an engine down. So in this way, you would generally taxi back on the right-hand engine. The left one is shut down, but the clutch is engaged and the right-hand engine drives both gearboxes. You retain all your utilities, your generators, your hydraulics, and the like. There were some unreliabilities with the thrust reverse system. Occasionally it would fail. You had an override switch that would allow you to deploy just one bucket, because without the override, it would say, right, there's something wrong with it. I'm not going to give you any of the buckets. But if there were certain crosswind limitations, like I think it was 10 knots crosswind, and you could engage it below 140 knots with the underwing tanks empty, which is typically the sort of scenario that you would have on landing. So when you were contemplating your final landing, you would assess what's the weather conditions today. Right, okay, I've got less than 10 knot crosswind. So in the event of a thrust reverse failure, I'm going to use override and single engine thrust reverse below 140 knots to slow the aircraft. And if I still haven't slowed enough, then I'll engage the overrun cable about 1,500 feet from the end of the runway. So that's the SOP. What you can see here is with the buckets deployed, they're going to reverse the jet efflux from the cans, the end of the engine, back over the fuselage at the base of the fin. The effect that had was reducing the aerodynamic effectiveness of the fin. So you lost a little bit of directional stability in the mid-range of thrust reverse before the engines had spooled up enough to generate deceleration that would drive the nose wheel harder onto the tarmac, guaranteeing you traction in that way. So my esteemed colleague had a bit of a brain fart, a bit of a coggy, and he had selected both reversers in a normal way after the nose wheel had come to life, having touched down. And he said he was going to use a bit of asymmetric thrust reverse to close the cross drive and effectively get the aircraft ready for the single engine taxi back. But he selected full reverse on one engine. But we'd already briefed the weather conditions, and I was too clever and said, well, it's within the release to service for single engine thrust reverse. It's non-standard. I'll save it as a debrief point. But what happened was, very quickly, we got some lateral drift build up. There'd been a phenomenon identified in some of the trials work where when reverse had been selected and deployed, the aircraft might slightly diverge in a direction that you perhaps wouldn't expect. So if you're powering up on the right-hand engine, you'd expect more retardation to the right-hand side of the center line, and the aircraft would yaw to the right. Well, the aircraft might, in the example I've talked about, might start to yaw left initially, requiring a bit of right pedal just to keep yourself on the center line. But then, of course, the retarding effect of the engine spooling up to max reverse is to pull you right, and you've got right pedal in, which is what I believe happened. So the aircraft very quickly starts to yaw dramatically to the right on the runway towards the edge of the runway, and I can see lights coming past. So the thing to highlight, because this is a fighter bomber, it's not a training aircraft, the back seat's not stepped up in any way. You can see in the picture behind you, Steve, the cockpit is directly, the Wizzo, the back seater, or in the case of this sortie, me in the back of the trainer, is directly behind the head box of the guy in the front or the girl in the front. And the view you have to directly in front of the aircraft is down the side of the ejection seat box. So it's quite challenging to land the aircraft from the back seat in sort of light crosswinds or no crosswind. We use the FLIR repeater to kind of give us a warm and fuzzy as we're tracking, the extended centerline on final approach, that it's all looking good, and then start to move our head from side to side, either side of the head box, to maintain SA about how close to the edge of the runway is. So we start yawing dramatically to the right, and I'm trying to look at a couple of small magnetic indicators on the glare shield in front of me, which tell me the status of the thrust reverser in the front, and also see how close we are to the edge of the runway as the lights go flicking past. It's north of Scotland, it's 5 o'clock, it's February, so it's kind of dusk. So the lights were helpful. But with the lateral acceleration on my noggin, it was very hard to keep my eyes on these little magnetic indicators. It just made my eyes flick, and I couldn't, watch it very easily. The memory drills in the event of this drift building up on a normal landing was to cancel the reverse and slam to idle. The sim didn't really replicate it, and it wasn't trained. So it was part of the boldface quiz. So the memory items, the vital actions that you had to be able to recite verbatim. But I think it's one thing to write it down, and given it's not trained in the simulator, something else to do it for real. And I'd never had it. I'd flown probably about 2,000 hours on the airplane. I'd never had it happen to me in the front seat. Generally speaking, the feeling amongst the IPs in the back seat was that the person in the front has got the best view to assess and would be best placed to manage this situation. So I had an override switch, which would allow me to either deploy the thrust reverser from the back seat or turn it off. But most of the time it sat in a middle position where it gave authority to the guy in the front. And that's where it was at landing. So I'm going, is he going to cancel reverse? I'm hoping he's going to do this pretty soon, because we're running out of room as we skid to the right-hand side of the runway. And so that the next slide kind of shows that. So at the bottom of the runway, you can see some skid marks here where I'm indicating with the cursor arrow. This is the secondary runway here. The main runway was runway 2305. This is runway 2811. So we yawed dramatically to the right. At one stage, it looked like we were pointing back towards the center line, but then the aircraft yawed back to the right again, and I realized I was out of runway. And you can see the skid marks here have gone down off the main service, and I felt the aircraft give a mild lurch as the right-hand main wheel went off the runway into this kind of this pocket between the two runways. And then I know I'm going across the secondary runway. I know somewhere out there are these aerials. The ground is pretty rough. It's kind of tussock grass and stuff like that. And I'm basically going, well, we're going across the runway now, and I can't see what's in front of me. And we're still doing, about 80, 90 knots. And I call for the ejection at that point. So I think what we can see here, this was taken from a helicopter, but I think you can see the perspex fragments from the canopy being rocket removed from the aircraft by rockets. So this is quite a surreal situation, because I have been in the sim on the previous Friday. This is a Tuesday the incident happens. I've been in the sim on a Friday, and it was a training requirement to recognize situations when it was appropriate to eject. So in the sim, I'd had to initiate ejection as the controls had burnt through short finals to land on this very runway. So in the sim, when you pull the handle, the simulator freezes. You can look at the parameters in terms of your height above the surface, your rate of descent, and go, well, yeah, more than a tenth of the rate of descent above the surface. That's probably a successful ejection. You simply push the handle back in, open the canopy, unstrap, and that's the detail over with, generally speaking. And of course, somehow this is going through my mind as it goes through overspeed, that I'm pulling the handle. And of course, things don't stop in reality. So the handle went clunk as I pulled it, like it did in the sim. But there's a pause, and then a whoosh as the rockets took the canopy off. Pause, and then the most mind-bending acceleration as you ride the rocket. I had always got a good posture and made sure I did when I simulated ejection in the simulator. I'm one of the generation of people that did ride a dummy rig with a quarter charge jet provost seat, a cartridge seat, back in the early 90s, but they stopped doing it because people injured themselves. But I got good posture, and so I remember seeing my boots. I remember seeing the rocket flare. my vision kind of closed into like a tunnel, and so I remember seeing my boots, and then the kind of the sky tilted as the seat deployed. I remember feeling some jerks as the various drogues deployed, and then the big jerk as the main canopy deployed, and then the seat, you've got the death grip on the handle, the ejection seat handle, and then as the seat falls away, it finds its way out through your thumb, and there's the seat lying on the grass, or at least one of them. So I look up, and we had some emergency drills to carry out, and these were drummed into us, and all those years and all that repetition made for some solid kind of mode habit patterns on my part. But they simply inflate the life jacket and adopt a parachute landing position. They'd always warned us that if you look down between your feet, you're going to misjudge how quickly the ground comes up to meet you. And I remember looking down initially and going, no, don't do that. Look at the horizon. And so I looked at the horizon. I got a nice view of the Moray Firth to the north of RAF Marham, and saw how quickly the ground's coming up. And I tucked myself into the parachute landing position with my knees tucked in, my elbows up on the parachute risers, elbows tucked in like that, and going, oh, this is going to hurt. This is going to hurt. But I landed on the grass and rolled out in exactly the way you see paratroopers do in the war movies, or if you watch any of these sort of trials footage, and it worked a charm. And I picked myself up, and I just, it's just one of those surreal moments. I've actually ejected, and I feel fine. I was expecting to have wrecked my back, and I feel fine. I then swear profusely, mostly at my colleague for having, ostensibly got us in this position, and also myself because I failed to rescue the situation. The background: we'd lost the jet 2 weeks before. They'd had a rear fuselage fire, and their controls had burnt through as they tried to make it to Stornoway. So I'm thinking, Christ, that's 2 ejections in 2 weeks. And so, this is where the self-recrimination starts. But because we put the pan call out, the fire service come roaring across the runway and pull up. And this fireman gets out, and he's running up to me just as I take my parachute off. He says, "You all right?" And I went, "Yeah, I think." And he says, looking at the aeroplane and looking at me, he says, "Do you want to shut it down, or shall I?" Because what we can see is the aircraft has gone up to its axles in the grass. It's sat there. The canopy's gone. You can see these ejection gun rods just poking out the top of the front and the rear cockpits. It's just sitting there rather forlornly. And I'm feeling bad about how badly I've parked it. And I think, well, he doesn't look very confident either. He gets to practice maybe once or twice a year, lifting us out of the cockpit. We play like rag dolls, and he tries to identify which switches he would use in reality. So this picture shows the ladders that we used. One ladder, because the engine was still running, we braced against this intake in this direction. And then the second ladder, we braced across it, and I climb up the steps. You get the smell of cordite from the ejection rockets. The cockpit displays are all smashed. It looks a bit different without the seats in there. I safe up the master arming switch, and then shut the engines down, and then climb down from the ladder. It's all a bit surreal. And then I see my oppo, who's lying on the grass behind the aircraft. And as the engines spool down, the efflux from the engines is gently sort of making his parachute flutter on the ground. And I think, oh my God, he's hurt. So I start to run towards him, and he says, "Lie down, you idiot." Because people have hurt their back in ejections, and with the adrenaline flowing, they go, "Oh, I'm fine." And all of a sudden they fall over as their spine is finally severed, or whatever. You've got some sort of injury, and it's just the adrenaline that keeps you going. Oh yeah, I should probably lie down at this point, shouldn't I? So I do. And at this point, Gary comes running across the runway. So Gary is a search and rescue crewman, because RAF Lossiemouth at the time had a flight with 2 Sea-King search and rescue helicopters. One was up in the mountains doing some training, and the other one had been being rectified by the maintainers and had just come up on state. But Gary had seen the ejection, grabbed a med pack, and come running across the runway to look after us. Now, Gary had been an avionics technician on 617 Squadron, when I'd served my first tour. So I knew him quite well. He was a great lad, and he quite liked the flight crew. He would come and drink with us downtown in Lossiemouth in the nightclubs, and we just really liked the guy. He was switched on. He was very capable. So it was a beautiful bit of serendipity that he's the guy that comes running across the runway and starts to look after us. And of course, after that, they start cutting our equipment off us. They put us on backboards, put us in the helicopter, and fly us to Inverness Hospital. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to Inverness Airport, because the RAF brought a VC-10 transport aircraft up to Inverness to take us down to Birmingham, where the military hospital was. Inverness Hospital just did the initial spinal X-rays to make sure that we were okay. We hadn't, really hurt ourselves. My colleague had broken his ankle on landing. I understand from talking to him, he was slightly distracted by looking down from his parachute of the aircraft he was just sat in. And, you can picture it's like a dusk. It was a nice evening. It's calm. And he sees the aircraft. It's quite pretty. And just seeing the strobe lights flashing away gently. Oh shit, the ground. Wallop. So he doesn't enjoy the same high quality landing that I did. And he broke his ankle. But, this is all established by Inverness Hospital. And at that stage, as I say, the RAF had put a VC-10 into Inverness. Now, it's not the longest runway in the world. It typically handles 737s and A320 class aircraft, turboprops and stuff like that. But I understand if they were to put a VC-10 in there again, they would have had to rip the runway up. They also stayed open well after normal hours. So I feel a prize idiot for not being able to rescue a situation. I'd let it get out of shape. But we were looked after so well. But there was a degree of irony, because they'd looked at our X-rays. Yeah, you're fine. So we actually then walked. My oppo with his crutches. We walked to the VC-10. We get to the VC-10, then we're back into the tender loving clutches of the Royal Air Force, and they tell us to lie down again, and they strap us back onto backboards. So again, it's like my back's pretty sore at this point. It's really soft tissue stuff, and it was more comfortable to draw my knees up. But they, of course, want you to lie flat. And like a lot of pilots, I'd had a bit of osteopathy, and, from flying fighters, it's pretty grueling on your neck and lower back and stuff like that. So I'd had all that kind of treatment. It's just part of managing that and doing active sporting kind of activities. So they strap us down. We were planning to fly to Birmingham, where this military hospital is located. But there's fog at Birmingham, and the VC-10 is not Cat 3 capable, so it can't do auto lands in fog. So it ended up going back to Brize Norton, which is the main transport hub for the RAF. And we were then driven up to Queen Elizabeth Birmingham Hospital in an RAF ambulance, driven, and looked after by people who were doing, the casualty evacuation from Afghanistan and things like that. So we were in the best possible care. So, yeah, I feel a bit of an idiot, to be honest, as I've alluded to, but we were looked after so well at every step of the way. When we got to Birmingham, go through all the checks and stuff like that. And, yeah, just to share with you, really, that I had a private room, and I managed to get some of my own clothes from home, and my wife had been able to join us as well. It was very good of the captain to get her on the flight with us, slightly bending some rules there. But she was down with us in Birmingham. So I've got a room to myself, and you see these lads from Afghanistan who have been hit by IEDs, and they're double amputees, triple amputees, whizzing up and down the corridors on their wheelchairs, flirting with the nurses, having a laugh. They're just indomitable spirits, and of course there would be tough times ahead for them. But seeing them, they'd sort of been hurt doing the business in Afghanistan, and there's me training excellent in my own room, just with not a mark on me, ostensibly. You feel a prize idiot. And I also got to see a young lad see his dad for the first time. He had been in a coma, so when you see that, yeah, it's tough. So, yeah, big shout out to the people in Queen Elizabeth, Birmingham, and how they look after people. So we were very well looked after. And I suppose the ride at the end of the story really is, I come back to the squadron, and I've got I had all my stuff cut up, all the G pants and all my flight checklists and everything had gone. impounded by the inquiry, and that had proceeded in the 2 weeks. I'd been interviewed and all that sort of stuff. I tried to share the learning points that I believe should be brought out for the instructor pilots in the back seat, and about memory items and how different it can be in the back seat with different controls. It'd never really been formalized. But I'd said to myself, right, okay, I'm not going to be rushed back into the air, and I'll go when I'm ready. And I literally just got onto the squadron, and there's a good friend of mine, Talsey. He said, mate, I've got a week to go in the Air Force, and I'm out of my pilot check currency, because one of the students had that he'd been checking had clicked on the wrong box on the computer and given him the check ride as well, so extended his currency inappropriately. So he realized he was out of currency. He's going, mate, any chance you could do a pilot check on me for my last week of flying in the Air Force? And I'm going, oh man, this is exactly what I said I wouldn't do. But you get back on the horse, and he's an excellent pilot, and I think, well, there's nobody better to go flying again with. And we did exactly the same sortie profile, back in the back seat, and because of the winds, we were actually landing on the short runway, and we had to use max thrust reverse, and if the thrust reverse hadn't worked, we would have been into the overrun cable. But the aircraft gave it the same shimmy that it did before we had our excursion off the side of the runway. And so we come off the runway in a suitably British way. He said, "You're right, mate, you've gone rather quiet there." I said, yeah, last time it felt like that. It didn't end so well. It's just, so that, hopefully you can see things didn't go very well. We learned a lot from it. We tried to share that. But at every stage of the way, we were looked after so well. Big shout out to people at Inverness Airport, Queen Elizabeth, Birmingham, to all the soldiers that were there. But I was flying 2 weeks later, and they looked at the lessons learned. We got some critiquing from the inquiry, but back into the air after just soft tissue, whiplash injuries 2 weeks later. So there we go.
How much of a surprise, Nick, was the ejection to your front seater then?
I did call it. So RSOP was to say eject, and I gave it one pause and then went for the handle.
Was he expecting that you would do that? I
mean, I think one of the things they talked to us about was perhaps we could have considered staying. He had a better view of the ground in front of him. As it happened, as you can see, the aircraft stayed on its undercarriage, but when you watch the HUD recording, because the HUD camera was recording throughout the incident, I was reassured to see how quickly it happened, because things go into that slow motion that you hear about as your brain steps up. It's processing, but it happened really quickly. But in the last few feet, the aircraft does start to sort of go sideways. It was just really counterintuitive to stay with the airplane going off road. And it was interesting. A lot of the navigators came up to me and said, "Well done, mate. I'm not sure I would have had the courage to pull the handle." They did say perhaps he could have said no, stay, but I think he was working. And this is the benefit of the 2C crew operations, is there's been more than one pilot saved by the Wizzo, navigator, or backseat occupant pulling them out whilst he's wrestling with an unrecoverable situation. I think in that situation, as you can see, we could have stayed, but I just couldn't see what was in front of me, and we were always taught eject in time. So the aircraft did fly again. It took them a while to fix the damage. The RAF has a categorization. So Cat 5 is a total write-off, Cat 1 minor damage. So when I parked it was Cat 2, but the lift out didn't go very well, and they made it Cat 3 from some mishaps on the lift out. But the way the aircraft was lifted out is where the wings hinge. The wing sweep pivot point is a strong point. It's a really clunky, really heavy duty part of the airframe, so they can attach a crane hoists to that point of the aircraft, and they lifted it out that way. But some things went wrong, and it was Cat 3 by the time they finished that. But it did fly again. So
what did your front seater say then about not deselecting the thrust reverser? So the root cause was the asymmetric thrust reverser application, and instead of going to mid-range, which would have been controllable, he went to full.
He should have not selected full asymmetric reverse at that stage. It should have been after vacating the runway and just taxiing back. What he should have done is rock inboard on the throttles, which would have deselected both the thrust reverse and the lift dump. The buckets are driven by high pressure air, and they stow in about 0.2 of a second. So the airflow reversal over the fin would have been solved at that point. You get clean airflow over the fin, re-establish some directional control. Perhaps as the engines spool down, you get a little push forward, but you get some clean airflow over the fin, and you can either then correct the trajectory of the aircraft with the nose wheel steering and then re-engage the thrust reverse appropriately with both engines. Mostly we would select reverse idle and roll to the end of the runway, but clearly for shorter runways, you could use max reverse down to an audio warner at about 100 knots, where I think it was 100 knots, I'm not sure, but you get an audio warner where it was warning of ingestion of the exhaust, which is being blown, having been deflected by the buckets, it's being blown forward and then re-ingested by the engine. So that's hot exhaust. There's potential for FOD as well. Any debris that's been dislodged off the runway, lifted up, blown forward into the intakes. So that was another reason to use reverse, idle reverse, or certainly cancel the or reduce the max reverse as the speed reduced. It was most effective at high speed. But yeah, that's really what he should have done. But as I say, the simulator didn't replicate it, so it wasn't a drill that was given to people in the sim. And although it was in the memory quiz, it wasn't. I think again it comes back to I have an opinion about the memory quizzes, and as I understand it, the Tornado Force had it. You had to write it out and get it verbatim correct, and that's something that the Italians and the Germans had kind of picked up from training in the USA. I feel quite passionately that it's whether you say gear or undercarriage doesn't matter. If it's saying gear or undercarriage up, as long as you move the lever to bring the wheels up, job done. What matters is about where your hands go around the cockpit. But I get a sense, and maybe I'm being unfair on the US brethren, but they get wrapped around the axle about the punctuation, figuring that if you know it that well, that you can recite it, yes. And I've seen some of your colleagues or some of your interviewees recite like memory drills from the F4 Phantom, the F4C, and it's that ingrained. But what I think really matters is where your hands go around the cockpit, where are you looking, that's what matters. Not whether it's the gear or undercarriage, or whether there's a comma there or not. But yeah, it wasn't something that'd been trained. So yeah, he should have cancelled reverse, re-established directional control of the aircraft, and then re-engaged both engines in idle reverse, or potentially taken an overrun cable. But as it happened, what he did was retard. With the reverser still deployed, he brought the throttle to idle, but the buckets are still deployed. So you're waiting for the engine to spool down before you get the clear airflow of the fin, which is too late by that point.
You obviously answered the question as to whether or not there were any immediate impacts on your career, because you ended up flying again 2 weeks later. But
yeah,
any long-term damage to your career? I think you left the Royal Air Force fairly soon afterwards, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I was intending to leave. I had got to the end of my contract on my last frontline tour, but if people remember the banking crisis, subprime mortgages and all that sort of thing, that impacted the airline industry to the extent there were no airline jobs to go to. The RAF was excellent. They were very kind to me. I had multiple short-term extensions to my contract, and eventually, quite rightly, asked me what my intentions were. So I elected to stay. And they needed people with my qualifications up on the conversion unit, so it was a quick win for them. I stayed flying. But no, I was concerned about whether it would affect my opportunities at getting a job in the airline industry. But as any professional aviator would, you cooperate with the investigation, try and make sure all the lessons are identified. And I talked to all the other instructor pilots, gave a briefing to them about what I learned, and tried to highlight the areas that I think they needed to watch out for, stuff that hadn't been discussed before. And it was kind of put down. There were multiple lessons identified from the report. Some of it supervisory for my colleague coming from the front line. about how long it had been since he'd flown, and a few other aspects there, and also about the performance of the nose wheel and what can happen under reverse. So I think other aircraft had runway excursions, and people had ejected in Goose Bay, for example, crosswinds, wet runways, stuff like that. People had punched out in that scenario before, so it was not unusual, but it had been it had been a long time since it had happened. So, it was really a case of drilling home the SOP, say, look, don't be clever with the reverse. Make sure you know what you're going to do if you get either a failure or if you get lots of drift on application of reverse, and make sure that you are taxiing back before you power up on one engine to close the cross drive clutch and enable one engine to drive both the gearboxes and then shutting down the other one. So it was kind of refocusing people's attentions on SOPs. I think I was maybe not trying to be clever, but I thought, well, it's a valid thing. It was within the release to service for asymmetric thrust reverse, but it got out of shape amazingly quickly.
Final question then, Nick. Did you log this as a landing?
I did. Just one sort of one liner saying ejected. Figure it's the Brit way, isn't it? Nicely understated. But other people have asked me, did he pass the check ride? And the answer is no. So, but we still contact each other on the anniversary of our ejection. So no hard feelings. It's just it comes under the category stuff happens sometimes.
Did you get a nice watch out of Martin Baker?
Good point. Yeah, Martin Baker did try to sell me one of their nice watches.
They tried to sell it to you.
Yeah,
cheapskates.
Yeah, but I was actually at the factory, so I'd like to say a big thank you to Martin Baker because you do get a chance to go and visit the factory if you've used their extreme furniture, and they were so nice about it. My father had a 70th birthday coming up, and you're racking your brains about what you can do that's memorable. Your parents have got enough ties, they've got enough socks, they've got enough widgets, and I thought, okay, I will contact Martin Baker. So for everyone who's ejected, you get an ejectee number, and there's a wall with a photo matrix of somebody punching out of a Harrier in Afghanistan, and the photo is made up of the names of everyone who's used their seats. So I contacted them by email saying, I'm ejectee number this. Any chance they could come and visit the factory and bring my dad? And they at short notice, maybe a week's notice, they said yes, and they were such wonderful hosts at such short notice to my dad and I. It was a great day for him. And it was a great opportunity to talk to the people in the factory. They're passionate about the product, and that so many people have been saved despite ejecting outside seat parameters. It's just an amazing thing. And I was fine, apart from soft tissue injuries like bruised shins from the leg restraints, that's a bit of whiplash to my neck. I was flying again 2 weeks later with no ill effects. So yeah, big shout out to Martin Baker. They're great people, great British firm.
But they still try to sell you a watch. That's disgusting.
Well, I'm not going to talk about Breitling because I tried to get a free service out there saying, yeah, and I've ejected, and I even put a picture of similar to the one that's on the screen here, saying, your watch kept running after the ejection. Any chance of a free service? No.
I think it's Bremont is the brand that Martin Baker used now, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, Breitling different, but I was chiseling for a freebie and got nowhere with it.
It's another good British brand, Bremont. Okay. We've done our piece for advertising British brands. So
yeah.
Nick, I wanted to say thank you so much indeed for coming on the channel and being a guest. And I do think this has probably been the most, I think this will probably be and will stand as the most authoritative guide around the Tornado, the GR1 and GR4 that is out there on the internet. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk us through everything for giving us your time. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed the other content you put out there, and I really enjoyed hearing other people's stories, and I just wanted to share a bit of the the inside track on the Tornado and what it was really like. So I hope people have enjoyed it, and thanks for having me on. Really appreciate that.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for tuning in to 10% True. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, hit the bell button to make sure you get notified of the next episode. Thanks and take care.